Hi, we continue in 1 Samuel 30 today, as David is in great danger or distress, being afraid that the people might stone him because they're bitter that their sons and daughters have been taken captive by the Amalekites and their town Ziklag has been burned down. So, as we're about to see, David will have to decide how to not only not get himself killed, but how to respond to this tragedy where both his wives have been taken captive. And as we look at this scene in 1 Samuel 30, we'll recognize, as we've been doing since the introductory video to the section on 1 Samuel 27 to 31, that this section is not in linear chronological order, but the scene we're seeing here in chapter 30 is simultaneous to the scene of Saul and Endor calling up Samuel via the woman there, and the final battle where Saul and his son Jonathan die in Gilboa. And we'll see some of the evidence for the parallel nature of it today, and we've seen some of it in previous videos. So you can watch both the introductory video and the last video on the first part of this chapter to see some of the evidence for why these are simultaneous. And they're both part of this larger chiastic structure. Here we're down in the very end here after the Philistines have rejected David, and David now comes to rescue his two wives, and parallel up here where David had rejected the Philistines via his killing of Goliath, and we heard about Jonathan's love and Michal's love. So here we heard of the people who loved David, and here we hear of the woman coming back, and then we'll hear about the death of Jonathan in the close of that there. So we already looked at the location sequence, and I also want to highlight the key words. So we're going to be looking today from here right through here, and we see one of the key words is the Hebrew that's translated here, raiding party. It's not always evident in the New RSV, so I'm highlighting it here as I've been doing. And a raiding party means something much short of a war. It's key that it's about booty. It's not about territory or political advantage. It's simply going in and taking some stuff. So we can almost think of it as burglary of the city, if you will. And that's really what happens here. And so that's a frame of it here. There's also another frame that starts from our passage today about the 200 men who were too exhausted to cross the river, the Wadi, and when they come back after that. And we'll look at that next time as well. There are also a couple of interesting parallels to our immediate scene here in chapter 36:9, and I glanced at this last time because we looked at this verse last time. It's parallel to what we saw back in chapter 23. And although I just showed you this chiastic structure here that goes from 15 to 31, in bringing this up, we notice there's another parallel structure. We saw earlier that chapters 24 through 26 were a little sandwich with the Nabal story in the middle and these two stories of David and Saul in confrontation in the cave or in the encampment in chapters 24 and 26. And that little three-chapter sandwich was followed in chapters 27 to 29 by another three-chapter sandwich. In this one, in chapters 27 and 29, in the bread, if you will, David is there with Asich and the Philistines. And in chapter 28, Saul is there with the woman of Endor and Samuel. So what we're seeing here is the parallels here in chapter 30 with chapter 23 are just reaching out from the frame of the two sandwiches. So chapter 30 follows the end of the second sandwich in 29, and this goes back before the first sandwich, which started in chapter 24. So it's not exactly chiastic, but there are some interesting parallels here, and they both have to do with the question of how David will get the advice or the wisdom that he needs to know what to do in the case of battle. So before we look at some of the verbal details in our scene here on the left side of the screen, I'd like to look at these parallels here so we can hear exactly what's being said. So in our immediate situation, David is in danger, as we just saw, because the people of Ziklag, his men who are with him, are upset, obviously, that their women and all their things have been taken away. In chapter 23, it was when David learned that Saul was plotting evil against him, and that was setting up the situation where David confronts him in the cave. And we heard earlier in the last video that David strengthened himself in Yahweh, and we saw that right here. And at the end of the scene, notice 3 verses down in verse 16, we heard that David strengthened his hand through Yahweh. So the narrator is affirming here there's something going on in both situations. We don't know exactly what that means. He strengthened himself in Yahweh. Presumably that's a form of just quiet prayer of some kind, but that phrase is not used very often, and there's no more detail to know exactly what that means. But in our latter case, in chapter 30, it sets up this issue with the ephod, and in chapter 23, it follows the issue with the ephod. So that's what we need to be looking at. So in the detail in the earlier one, the question was about the people Keilah. So David says, "O Yahweh, the God of Israel, your servant," meaning himself, of course, "has heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city. And now," he asks, "will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Yahweh, the God of Israel, I beseech you, tell your servant." And we get this laconic reply. Yahweh said, he will come down. And then he asks again, then David said, will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And Yahweh says, they will surrender you. Notice in both situations, nothing is said about how this communication is happening, but it's preceded by bringing the ephod. And it's not explained what the ephod is. We'll look at that in just a minute. We'll literally look at an image of it, as well as we'll look at the literary evidence for it. But once he's brought it, David just simply seems to be speaking directly to Yahweh. But alert readers, which would say readers familiar with the wider cultural context and the literary context, will know a little more about what's going on. And that's what we'll need to look at there. And some of the clue is both in this situation and in this one, on the left side here, is the rather mechanical response we hear from Yahweh. So here, when Abiathar brought the ephod to David, David inquired of Yahweh, shall I pursue this band? Shall I overtake them? And Yahweh answered, pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue. And in both cases, David takes that advice and goes out. And he's successful. So one of the questions we need to ask is, what do we understand is happening in this transaction? And what do we expect that the authors or editors are trying to tell us about David's relationship with Yahweh in contrast to Saul's relationship with Yahweh? Because there are a number of details that we'll see when we look into our passage that help us to see that while Saul is seeking illegally, according to his own rules, to get advice via a medium, as it's translated, or a ghost woman, or when we look at chapter 28, we'll have to consider how to refer to her, but some kind of intermediary between the living and the dead, and specifically he wants Samuel, and Samuel will not speak to him. And when we get to that, that's having the narrator told us that Yahweh would not speak to him by many means, and we'll look at those details. So we know that while David is seeking Yahweh's advice in one way or another, Saul is completely shut out from Yahweh, and even Samuel won't talk to him about anything other than what he's already told him. So also we'll see that in the next scene, and we might as well look at these at the same time, when an Egyptian appears in the open country and David inquires who he is, we'll see that this scene here in 1 Samuel 30, 11 to 15, and what follows in the narrator's description of Saul's death at Mount Gilboa in 31, 1 to 6, are both collectively parallel to the scene at the beginning of 2 Samuel, after the death of Saul, when an Amalekite young man who escapes from the camp of Israel testifies. And the blue here shows both the narrator's view here in 1 Samuel 31 and the Amalekite's report in 2 Samuel 1 about Saul's death, and they are not the same. And we'll see a number of other parallels there, including the Egyptian man not willing to take David down to the raiding party until David promises not to kill him, and the Amalekite man wasn't so sharp, and he did get himself killed. But one of the connecting pieces here that's so key is the third day. So he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days or 3 nights, and he explains shortly, my master left me behind because I fell sick 3 days ago. So being left behind there is, as he describes here, we'd made a raid on the Negev of the Cherethites and that which belongs to Judah and the Negev of Caleb. So he was all in this lower area here. So he hadn't eaten or drunk for 3 days, but he's coming from this area over to here in 3 days. But as we can see from this scene here, after the death of Saul, the Amalekite man, as he's identified down here, on the third day appeared in Saul's camp. And this is while David's in Ziklag. So this is someone coming all the way from up here where Mount Gilboa is, all the way down to Ziklag. That certainly seems like more than a 3-day journey, as we saw last time. But the story is certainly coordinating them to highlight that Ziklag was being burned down just when Saul was killed. And therefore David was not involved in the killing of Saul. Maybe, as we'll see. So going back to our immediate scene here, let's look a little bit at the background of the ephod so we can know something about it. Here's the literary perspective on it, and if we'd like to see how the book of Exodus describes in great detail the parts of it, you can see that in Exodus 28, and I'll show an image in just a minute. But one of the questions is, do our authors of 1 Samuel here or 2 Samuel know Exodus? The answer is almost certainly yes. My view has been consistently over the years that Exodus is an old text, and as we'll see when we get to the transference of the reign to Solomon and to Solomon's son Rehoboam, the story of Moses and the Pharaohs in the beginning of Exodus is in many ways parallel, and I would suggest a deliberate counter story to that story. So from that perspective, the Exodus narrative, at least the core of it, which is not to say there weren't additions and editorial details added and changed later on. All the biblical texts didn't have copyright the way we have, and later writers felt free to adjust them and adapt them to what made more sense to them. So we don't know all the details of that of Exodus, and I won't get into that now. But at least the core story of the Exodus seems to be from the time of the pinnacle of monarchy with Solomon and Rehoboam as an expression of alternative form of bonding, not around the king, but around the priest Aaron. So we'll look at some of that when we get to the later in the monarchy story. But for now, let's look at how the ephod is displayed throughout the Deuteronomistic history. And I want to note that it's in Exodus a large number of times. I believe it's 20-something times. We have it here in Judges a couple times, and here in 1 Samuel, once in 2 Samuel, but nowhere else in the Deuteronomistic history, which is to say it's never in Joshua and it's never mentioned in 1 or 2 Kings. It's mentioned in passing once in Genesis, but and then a couple of times in Numbers outside of Exodus, and that's all. So let's look at it here. So in Judges, we hear Gideon made an ephod out of what's described in the verses earlier, a huge amount of gold jewelry, and it became a snare. All Israel prostrated themselves to it. So here it becomes something like an idol. And similarly here, later in Judges, the man Micah, and both the verse here and 17:5 and 6, 2 verses, and this longer scene here is both about the same person, Micah. And he made an ephod and teraphim. And we'll see teraphim in second Samuel, and we saw teraphim in Genesis when Rachel takes her father Laban's teraphim and puts them under the saddle and sits on them. That teraphim are little statues of some kind of something, but we don't know because there's no further description. But the reason I'm so vague on it is because in the next element here we hear ephod and teraphim connected with something even more vague, an idol of cast metal. So two different kinds of carved things, and the idol of cast metal is to suggest that teraphim is probably clay, and that's the distinction there. But in any event, all three of these together are seen as idolatrous, but also as symbolic of being a priest, because the offer is made to this man Micah here, and quietly they put your hand over your mouth and come with us, and be to us a father and a priest. Is it better for you to be priest to the house of one person, or to be priest to a tribe and clan in Israel? So he accepted the offer and took the ephod, the teraphim, and the idol, and went along with the people. But this is plainly seen negatively from the authors of Judges, because the phrase that followed the original element of Micah making these was, in those days there was no king in Israel, all the people did what was right in their own eyes, which parallels the words of the very last verse of Judges after the horrible scene of the rape of the concubine and the killing of the Benjamites and all that terribleness. And so what Judges is seeing is, if we had a king, these kinds of things wouldn't happen. So this is seen as an expression of how idolatrous people were when they did what was right in their own eyes, rather than listen for what was right in Yahweh's eyes. So in 1 Samuel, we've already seen that Samuel was ministering, the young Samuel was ministering a boy wearing a linen ephod, and there it certainly meant positively as a symbol of what? Priesthood, like Aaron, or prophecy? It's not clear. But just a few verses later, we hear the quote about Aaron the priest wearing the ephod. So in that case, Samuel is to be like a priest, to substitute for Eli's corrupt sons, as we'll see, because here we see way later, a couple of generations later in chapter 14, Ahijah, son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, was carrying an ephod. So another priestly example of it. And here the priest Ahimelech, when David was trying to escape from Saul earlier, tells him that the sword of Goliath is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. They're in some kind of altar there before all the priests get killed by Doeg. And then that's a scene that happens here where the king says to Doeg, kill them, and he kills 85 priests identified who wore the linen ephod. Here they are named as priests, but here as a synonym, those who wore the linen ephod means priests. Now we have our two scenes here where Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, the one who survived from this whole slaughter here, not the Eli people, but the one who escaped after the killing of the 80, twice brings David the ephod, here in chapter 23 and also in chapter 30. And as I put in brackets here, an inquiry of Yahweh follows, but in the text, as we see on the left side, there's no cause and effect between the bringing of the ephod and what happens here. So we need to look a little more closely clearly at that. And this image here, I think, of the entire priestly garment, which is taken from Exodus 28, really shows us what's going on. Right, as my note right here from Van Dam, a scholar writing at Bible Odyssey, which is a lovely site. If you're not familiar with Bible Odyssey, it's a group of short entries by excellent biblical scholars whose work you can trust, giving you some basic cultural information. So you can see right down there below at BibleOdyssey.org. I really encourage you to go there. But what he notes about that here is, since the Urim and Thummim, which aren't mentioned here, but I'll explain what those are in just a moment, were kept in the high priestly breastpiece, which was attached to the ephod, a simple reference to the ephod can indicate a reference to the Urim and Thummim. It's hard to say something. So we can look back here to where Saul was in chapter 28 to see why this is important. So back here we heard, when Saul inquired of Yahweh, Yahweh did not answer him, not by dreams or by Urim. And this is the only place in the Deuteronomistic history where Urim is mentioned, other than in Deuteronomy 33:8 and 1 Samuel 14:41. Let's look at both of those just briefly. So in Deuteronomy we hear this: as of Levi he said, give to Levi your Thummim and your Urim to your loyal one whom you tested. So they're being said to the tribe of Levi, they get the responsibility for holding these two things, whatever exactly they are. And then we saw in 1 Samuel 14:41 here, Saul said, O Yahweh, God of Israel, why have you not answered your servant today? We see that Saul's problem getting Yahweh to listen to him goes back a ways. If this guilt is on me or on my son Jonathan, O Yahweh, God of Israel, give Urim. If this guilt is on your people Israel, give Thummim. And then they take Lot, indicated by Lot, but it says the Lot, like what's happening with Urim and Thummim is some kind of Lot, which is to say something like rolling dice or picking the small stick, or like a magic 8-ball that I had as a kid, maybe you did too, where you put a question to it and inside the 8-ball, like an 8-ball in a pool table, is a little die that's floating in liquid, and it floats to the top and gives a generic kind of answer. So the implication of all this is that when the ephod is brought, that implies the breastplate and the Urim and Thummim that are on it, which we don't know anything independently of, but seem to be something that gives a yes or no answer, which is why when we hear these inquiries, we get the answer that's basically what you asked is what you get in response. Rather than just yes or no, you get the words brought back. Even though in this one it's intensified, the question is, shall I overtake? And the answer is, you shall overtake and you shall surely rescue. But here it was more direct. Will they surrender? They will surrender. So what's implied by our immediate scene, moving back to 37 here, is that when David asks for the ephod, he's really asking for the Urim and Thummim. And so when we hear this exchange between David and Yahweh, we have to ask, is this really a relationship? If we're going to assume, as many scholars do without doing what I just did for you, to argue that what's happening here is not that David has a direct relationship with Yahweh, like, say, Abram in chapter 12, where they're having a conversation, or like the prophets who dare to speak, thus says Yahweh, or even like Samuel, who we saw in 1 Samuel 8, was talking directly to Yahweh. This is not necessarily David talking to Yahweh. This is David rolling dice in the name of Yahweh and assuming that the correlation of the dice is divine causation. Does it work that way? Well, it does in this case. Does the text expect us to hear this as an expression of David's relationship with Yahweh? That's not nearly as clear. So we have to recognize here that the text, as it so often is ambiguous at best, because we don't know that David really has this kind of direct relationship. It said earlier in verse 6 that he strengthened himself in Yahweh, but it didn't say exactly what that was. So let's just look at our immediate scene here, and I can already tell we won't have time to look at the Egyptian scene today, so we'll look at that in the next video. So and the word here, shall I pursue this band, let's put the key words back up for now, is the same word for raiding party. So the parallel is lost in the translation. Shall I overtake them? 3 times in the verse. Pursue, yes, for you shall surely overtake and surely rescue, which indicates the doubling in the Hebrew. Overtake, yes, overtake, and rescue, yes, rescue. So he sets out with the 600 who were with him, and they came to the Wadi Besor here on their way back from wherever exactly they were, and where they left 200 behind, who were too exhausted, as we see here, only here in its parallel on the other side of the chapter in 21, to Hebrew the Wadi Besor, to cross over. I'm using that word for crossing over, we've seen a number of times. And so that sets up the scene here where we'll encounter in the open country an Egyptian. And I'll just stop here and we'll look at that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.